Welcome back. How are you doing, Kirk?
Doing fine, Sheldon. About yourself?
Doing pretty good. How was your week off?
Oh, it was excellent. I was up in a northern area where for most of the time you couldn't even hear a human sound. It was just the wind whispering in the pines, the occasional bird, usually a chickadee or a blue jay, and or even a squirrel, and just absolutely therapeutically rejuvenating and restful. Loved
Very
it.
nice.
Kayaking and canoeing and fishing and even nightscape photography, lots of reading, even played cribbage, had a cribbage tournament with my wife.
Fun.
Best of 5. I went right down to the last game.
She won, didn't she?
I know, yeah.
I could tell because you didn't say you won. But she won.
Yeah, that was a bit of a bummer.
Oh. Came out of nowhere, or was it a pretty solid win?
No, we were very close on all 4 on the first 4. Like we're talking, usually ended the game within like 4 or 5 peg holes, but the last one, it was more like 10 pegs.
You got beat up pretty bad then.
Yeah, it was like luck on her part. She got the right cards. I didn't, so
Sure.
what can you do?
Nice. And
Probably.
did you use a Durston tent, or what kind of tent did you use?
No, actually, we have a friend who let us use their cottage, so it was very luxurious, even to the point of having hot showers and a wood and a stove to cook on. Like it was just the lap of luxury.
So you were in nature, but you brought comfort to nature.
Yeah, it's a cottage. It's right on a very slow moving river that moves so slow you're not even. It took me a couple of years to figure out which way the current goes, but yeah, it's just beautiful.
Very nice.
And it's off the beaten track. No cell phone reception, no internet. You're just back to nature.
Very cool. I'd have to bring my own cell tower with me if I went there then.
Well, I do. I have thought about bringing my Elon Musk Starlink system with me, but now they're charging for that. So, and besides, I have to take it off my roof every time, which is a bit of a pain.
And you just forget a screw or something like that up at the cabin, then you'd have to go back, and that would be awful.
Yeah, that would be.
All right. Well, so today we're going to talk about something that I know, Kirk, you're working through right now with some friends of yours, skepticism. So I just did a quick search on Twitter, and there's lots of people that are like Skeptic George and Skeptic John, and they really love this word skeptic. Now, some of them, it's not a religious thing. They're skeptic about, they have skepticism about, one guy was like Elon Musk. He's skepticism about everything that Elon's doing. But let's get into this a little bit. What is skepticism? And will I believe you?
Yeah. Well, I mean, skepticism can be as formal as a philosophical position that you take. And it's not that, an extreme form is you can even be skeptical of your own existence. Rene Descartes, for example, wondered if he actually exists or what was going on, but he concluded one of the famous things that people know about him is that he concluded that he thinks, therefore he must exist. Something is doing the thinking, and it seems to be him. So at least he must exist, although everything else could still be figments of his imagination. Or, I mean, there's the brain in the vat problem in philosophy, where it's kind of like in the first episode of The Matrix, the first Matrix movie. Everybody is in a vat with electrodes in their brain, giving them all this false life, like a fake life, a fake experience of everything. And they don't even realize it. And that's actually not a new thing with the movie Matrix. That's been around for a long time. It's the brain in the vat problem. How do you know you're not just a brain sitting in a bowl somewhere where scientists are doing experiments and there's electrodes all over in your brain giving you all these fake experiences? Or before the era of science, how do you know it's not just demons giving you fake experiences in your brain? So that's extreme form. And an extreme form of skepticism you might call solipsism, where you're skeptical about everything, and you can really make no decisions about anything, because nothing is as far as you know, you might not even exist, or if you do, nothing else.
So what gets somebody to get to that point? Like, obviously they would have a questioning nature or something to them that makes them really question a lot of stuff. But that's almost in a case where you'd almost go insane.
Yeah, I would say it is bordering on, I would say it's a mental disability at that point. It's it's not a biological problem. It would be a psychological problem where they simply think they only exist. And how would they get there? Well, it's not that difficult. Once you begin to clue into the fact that the first step is that everything that you think you see around you is actually just a reconstruction. Photons hit your retina, then there's some chemical reprocessing, and then more processing in the brain to construct some sort of a thing we call a picture. But there's been so much processing between the outside world and the time it hits your brain that how do you know that what you think you're seeing is what is actually out there? Now, that's maybe one of the first steps. And then you begin to realize, well, wait a sec, I had dreams last night, and some of those dreams seemed pretty real at the time. How do I know I'm not just in one big, long dream? And one of the problems with for example, the brain in the vat problem is that there's just no experiments you can do to figure out if you're being totally deceived or not, simply because even the experiments that you would do might be just figments of your imagination, and you're experimenting on nothing in the end.
Like, I've always heard you pinch yourself to make sure it's not a dream, but what if you're dreaming that you're pinching yourself?
You're just dreaming you pinch it, or you happen to put your hand on a hot stove. Well, you're just dreaming that you're putting your hand on a hot stove, and all that pain you're experiencing, you're just dreaming that as well.
And the smell too, and all of
everything,
that.
everything. Now, one of the things that, for me personally, that keeps me from going too far down that road is that I know when I wake up in the morning, there's an inconsistency in dreams and what I call real life. There's just a steady, smooth, unbroken flow of events that don't have really any discontinuities. Whereas in a dream, you're walking along doing something, and all of a sudden, bang, you're in Vancouver on a high rise. And then all of a sudden you remember, I got to get to the airport. And I mean, it's just totally can be disjointed and disconnected and discontinuous. The other thing is that in what we call real life here, which I believe is real life, by the way, there's a lot of things you don't have control over. And if this was all just a dream, if it was just my imagination, why aren't I a multimillionaire who never gets old? Why don't I have just like my own private jets that don't cost anything to fly, and so on? Why can't I explore? Why don't I have an interstellar spacecraft to explore the galaxy? And so I realized that there are constraints, and these constraints don't seem to be coming from within, they come from without. So this extreme form of solipsism, where you think you're the only reality or suspect you might be, has issues. And so even though you can't do experiments, you can argue that no, there must be an external reality out there, because there's things that are happening to me that I wouldn't imagine on my own initiative, that I wouldn't invent. And also the continuous flow of events. Whereas if you're a brain in a vat in some experiment, and the scientists say, okay, let's go home for the day, flick the switch, bink, and then the next morning they flick it on again. And today, let's do math experiments on Kurt Thurston's brain. Well, I would go from having experienced maybe water skiing all of a sudden to a flick of the switch where there's nothing happening, and then all of a sudden I'm doing math. We don't see that happening in what we call real life. So we can be assured, I think, to a pretty high degree of confidence that there is an external reality, and we are actually interfacing with that. That's the extreme form of skepticism, and I don't often run into that. What I more often run into is this idea that it's intellectually cool, or maybe it's the most safest intellectual position to take, that to be skeptical of anything. I mean, some people will be skeptical of everything, but I find that no, they're only skeptical of certain things. And usually the things I'm talking about is the existence of God. Did Jesus Christ actually exist? What about the Bible? How do we know that what we have today was actually what was originally written down? And how do we know what was written down is true? And so there's all this evidence that's out there, but they take a skeptical approach to that, because I can't prove everything with 100% certainty. And so that's where the skepticism comes in, is that no matter what I say, or no matter how much evidence I might put on the table, they would just say, yeah, but I think, we may discover something tomorrow or in a century that might explain all that. And therefore, I don't think you really made your case. And I think it's better just to be skeptical about the whole thing.
So is it a lack of evidence in their mind, or is it I don't want to believe the evidence that's there, I'm therefore going to deny it?
Well,
or give it less weight than what I need or what I want to use to make a decision.
Yeah, well, I think you've hit both of those things could be the case. So let's just take the simple one first. The first one you mentioned there. A lot of times, like just all the time, pretty much, I'm running into people who would like to believe in God. They would like to put their faith in Christ for eternal life and so forth, but they spend a lot of time online and they read all sorts of articles that cast doubt on, whatever evidence I might put forward. And so even though they would like to believe these things, they're almost immobilized or neutralized from making any kind of a decision on this, because they're hearing all these, let's call it doubt creation, going on that they're getting online. Now, there's legitimate questions to be discussed online, but I find I am just amazed that people who are actually very intelligent and bright will watch stuff online and not seriously put the same degree of skepticism on those claims that they do on, say, the evidence for Christ. They're putting a ton of skepticism there. Not so they tend to just basically accept more or less. Now, that's not always the case. Like, for example, I met with a fellow last Saturday who tends to be skeptical of, the Christian evidence that I might put forward. But at the same time, he recognizes that some people's reasons for not believing in God are just totally bogus and illogical. And so that's a person who thinks more clearly on these issues. So for the first kind of skepticism, all I have to do is say, well, wait a sec here. Have you applied the same questioning to those counterclaims you're reading online? All they need to know is to see that the evidence is actually very good. Or the other thing to look at is, okay, well, just grant that for the sake of a thought experiment, what you're hearing over there, and now tell me how much evidence supports that aspect of things. And the interesting thing is that a lot of times the person will have certain reasons that for being immobilized as far as putting their faith in God or whatever, certain reasons that when you actually think about it, there was no actual evidence to support those counter reasons. In other words, I might say, well, we have the explosion, we have an empty tomb on the third day as evidence that something happened in first century Jerusalem with regard to the resurrection. And I could expand on that, and that's a different episode. But somebody online will say, well, actually, what if the disciples stole the body? Or what if, one or two, three different scenarios? And then they're all in a state of doubt and indecision. But then I respond by saying, well, okay, let's consider that. So what's the evidence they have that the disciples stole the body? What evidence can they put forward? And it turns out that for most of the skepticism that they have, there's simply no evidence whatsoever. It's just the fact that alternate story was given. But alternate stories don't carry any weight at all if there's not any evidence to support them. And so you got to take a story that actually has some evidence and a story that has no evidence, and the most rational position to take is the one that at least has some evidence in support of it. Now, that's the first kind of skepticism, and it's more like an involuntary skepticism.
Is that similar to like somebody who would fall into more conspiracy theory type things, where it's like, I don't believe 9/11 happened the way the government said it happened because I don't trust the government. Therefore, it must have been an inside job. Then start building all sorts of ways that it could have happened, and then eventually you come up with something that's hard to argue against because it's almost so complex and unreasonable that there is no argument against it other than, are you kidding me?
Yeah.
The government did all this. The government that can't get anything right got all this right and was able to keep it a secret while they were doing it. They were not able to. There were no leaks as this was happening. Are you serious?
Yeah, the more people involved in a conspiracy, the higher the probability somebody's going to spill the beans, so to speak. And I find that a lot of the reasons people will give that they read online somewhere don't amount to much more than simply a conspiracy theory. And you'll see them headlines sometimes on YouTube, like this is all made up. You might see some headline. They lied about it, the whole thing, that sort of thing. And then what you read is conspiracy theory. A number of years ago, I would say way back, a few decades ago, there was a book that a professor gave my sister. She was working at McGill University at the time. The professor says, this totally destroys Christianity. And it was an interesting book. And what was it? Holy Blood, Holy Grail, or it's so long now, I can't remember the exact title. So I thought, wow, I better read this. This sounds, I have a tendency my preference is actually to read the arguments against Christianity rather than the ones in favor of it, because I'm always interested in what people are saying against it. So I read this and I realized, wow, there is not a shred of evidence to back any of this up. It was a gigantic conspiracy theory on how Jesus didn't really die, and he ended up marrying Mary Magdalene. They escaped to the south of France, and so on and so forth, and they had kids. Well, okay, that's amazing. I mean, if you just read this and just swallow it, you got serious doubts until you say, well, wait a sec here. Do we have any evidence that Jesus did not die? That he actually married Mary Magdalene and ran off to the south of France and had progeny that continue to this day? Actually, we don't have a shred. So what I find that some people's skepticism is based on is that in any event that occurs in history, there's evidence that you can marshal in favor of that event, even in the courtroom. So if you go to a court case, there'll be certain pieces of evidence that they'll bring to argue one position or another. But then there's the pieces that you can't find evidence for. Like, you can't possibly find 100% of evidence for 100% of everything that occurred on that car accident or murder or whatever it is that's being tried in court. And so in these gaps where there is no evidence this is often where these conspiracy theories, or especially arguments against Christianity, these anti-Christian conspiracy theories begin to battle. Where ignorance, I have a saying that I've often said, where there is ignorance, speculation flourishes. So the speculation flourishes in the absence of knowledge and evidence. And once you realize that this whole gigantic, very creative and fascinating speculation actually has no evidence, then it just becomes a pipe dream. A more recent one that affected a ton of people was Dan Brown's, what was the name of that book?
Da Vinci Code. I've been
Da Vinci
thinking about
Code.
that the whole time that you've been talking about this other book.
I bought that book and read it through, carefully underlining everything. And what the difference in Dan Brown's book is, if you write in the preface, he states this is a fiction, but the historical aspects of this are all true, and they're true. And so with that in mind, the reader then begins, this is an extra hard one to deal with, because supposedly those historical aspects are all true. However, I used to do a seminar on this, did at a number of universities in Canada here, on Dan Brown's book, actually looking at what he called the historical evidence. And wow, he was, let's put it this way, he cooked the books pretty good on that historical evidence.
He made a lot of money on that too.
Oh, yeah, he did.
Good movie. I enjoyed the movies and
I enjoyed the book too. I enjoyed the book. Yeah. Except this is just total hogwash. Because I knew enough of the history, the actual evidence behind this, and even some of the documents he cites, and how there's one document he cites that proved that Jesus had married, I think, Mary. Well, the real document is there's a lot of missing words and phrases and sentences in it. Well, Dan Brown helps us out by having that character talking about the thing. He fills in the blanks with all the words that will support his case. Well, that's sketchy would be a mild term for that. So anyways, this is one form of skepticism that people have. I would call it an involuntary kind. They don't want it. They really would like to put their faith in God, but they just heard so much stuff from online that they're not sure what to think anymore. Now, I'm not saying, and I should be careful here, there are legitimate questions that can be raised and discussed online on legitimate pieces of evidence that are objective discussions.
Can you give an example of one?
Let me see. Legitimate. A legitimate question would be, here's a really simple one. How do we know that the Bible we have today has not been translated from translations and on and so forth? Now, as long as you're asking the question, that's a legit question to ask. But then along comes somebody and asserts that, the Bible is, and I've seen a lot of people affected by this. In fact, I have a quote from a comedian. If I had thought about this ahead of time, I'd bring it up. It's some comedian, and he says the Bible is a translation from a translation who passed it through, this priest and this guy and at a meeting, and it just goes on, and it's hilarious because by the time he's finished, the Bible could have started off as a recipe for, let's say, chocolate cake, and has been so much changed and translated and approved and censored and whatever that what we have today is what we call the Bible. I think I saw
that quote. It's a relatively recent one, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, it's several years old now. By several, I don't know. It's 5 years old. I don't remember the exact. I did have the quote.
I think you just said I'm old is what you said, because I'm thinking it's recent, and that means within the last 10 years it's recent.
Oh yeah. So okay, it was the last 10 years. Yeah, I think it's definitely in the last 10 years, and I did know the name of that. But so there are legit questions like, how do we know that the tomb was empty? Like what? But you'll see people making assertions, and where it crosses the line to become illegitimate or just fantasy is when it no longer has, when they've messed with the evidence to tweak it. Like you'll see, for example, all these so-called gospels that online they'll be suggesting these were banned by the church. These were prevented from being in the Bible, as if, they say something so shocking that the good old boys deciding what's going to be in the Bible back, say the Council of Nicaea is, and they, by the way, they did not do this. Like, so many people think the Council of Nicaea, they decided what books are going to be in the Bible. That is total hogwash. That wasn't even an item on the agenda for discussion at the Council of Nicaea. It had to do more with the deity of Christ and whether he was fully God and fully human, but had nothing to do with what books are in the Bible. And in fact, one of our best and earliest Greek manuscripts of the New Testament was probably written in the first part of the 300s, like say between 310, 325 AD, and the Council of Nicaea was right at the end of that. And so there would be, back then it would take years to produce a hand-done nice copy of, say, the New Testament, or a year or two at least, but it was a painstaking process. So anyways, there's illegit stuff thrown in with legit stuff to massage the evidence, or they're just stories made up out of whole cloth, just wild imagination, just unfettered, about Jesus marrying Mary Magdalene, or these so-called books, these hidden gospels or forbidden gospels. Forbidden. There is not any history in the first few centuries, and that's where the Bible, by 300 AD, the Bible, we know we have a hard copy that dates to probably the early part of the 4th century, which is somewhere around 320 AD, plus or minus. So by then, the Bible, the New Testament was done. And there is no evidence whatsoever that there was any so-called forbidden gospels. In fact, a lot of the so-called forbidden gospels weren't written until at least 100 to 300 or 400 years after the time of Christ. So they're not even historically associated with Christ in the 1st century. So to suggest that this is the case causes a lot of people doubt, and perhaps to become skeptical of the truth claims of Christianity or the validity of the Bible or whether we got today, and so forth. And it just goes on and on. Now, Bart Ehrman is another popular one that they will watch. But I have to say this, is that Bart Ehrman is, in the academic world, a very respected scholar. But when you watch Bart Ehrman's videos, he will say and do things and pull tricks that he would never do in an academic environment, because he knows he can get away with more debate tricks or pulling fast ones, so to speak, or asserting things that he would be called on immediately. He would be called out if he tried that, say, at an academic conference. And so this is something.
Why is this is something that's been in my head for a little while. There's a lot of effort and skepticism put into trying to say Christianity's wrong.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
A lot of those people would not put the same effort into any other religion or into any other context. Some people, it's their career.
Literally.
Why is it something that people still feel so strongly about to fight something they don't believe exists?
Yeah. Well, now we're getting into the second aspect of skepticism. Those people who, it's not because they've been, immobilized by something they heard, but they really want to put their faith in God. We're getting to the second aspect of skepticism, where I notice that they're more skeptical of the things that they don't want to believe, but not so skeptical of the everyday things that they want to believe or that are necessary to make it through the day. And the first question that you've raised is a very big one and a very important one. Now, I've been in discussions of faith for literally probably, more than 40 years. And most of that on university campuses. And I have noticed that you will get people talking, you'll find arguments or objections to, say, Hinduism or Buddhism or Islam, or Shintoism, but nothing. It's relatively minor. It's more than just minor. It's almost nothing in comparison to the amount of energy and resources and people devoting themselves to trying to just undermine Christianity or undermine people's faith in in God and Jesus Christ. So why is that? Well, there's at least two reasons here. Number one is that, and this is the simple, fast one, and then we'll get into the second reason, which strikes more to the human heart. The first and foremost one, or the first and fastest one, would be, according to God, there are angels. He has created angels, and they were all created flawlessly, perfect and beautiful and very powerful. But a certain segment of them decided on their own free will to turn away from God. And the chiefest of them is known as Satan. So in our society, we've been taught to kind of laugh or snigger when somebody actually believes in the devil, so to speak. I think people should really seriously rethink that. If you go to visit many developing countries, you'll find that's people don't laugh at that. In fact, now you might respond by saying, well, they're just ignorant. Well, no, wait a sec here. That's a bit of a North American kind of arrogance there. The reason that they don't laugh at it, because Satan has a little different strategy in a lot of developing countries where he's very open. Many people will be able to recount like horrific things. We have run into, let's call it supernatural opposition in certain countries where things occur in front of large crowds, just they're blatantly evil and supernatural. I'm talking about, say, showings of the Jesus film, for example. There have been some quite remarkable supernatural opposition to this in certain developing countries in the past. So in those countries, people have a terrible fear of Satan, and so they will tend to not want to disturb the supernatural evil forces, and they will fall into line, so to speak. Here in North America, there is a tendency to say, well, that's just bogus, which allows that nothing is more dangerous than an enemy that's loose in the camp that you can't even see and don't believe in. So they can work freely and unhindered behind the scenes and take down your entire civilization. And that is precisely what we're seeing happening in Western civilization today. We are seeing the slow disintegration and dismantling of our civilization. And when you trace back what's underlying this and where does this go, it starts to converge on moral decisions that humanity is making pertaining to greed and sexuality, unrestrained. The sexual revolution would be an example, the abandonment of sexual morality, which we have talked about before with the research of J.D. Unwin. All of this tends to destroy our civilization. So Satan can work in two ways. So one of them would be, obviously, if Christianity is true, if it is true, then it follows that there are forces of evil that are doing everything in their supernatural power to stop it. Everything. And that would include, in fact, Satan is described by Jesus as the father of lies. He is.
And if you go back to when Jesus was being tempted by Satan, by being tempted, I mean Satan was trying to tempt him to worship Satan. You look at the temptations, he's going right after the kind of things that humanity would fall for.
Yep, exactly. Some are physical attributes, some are physical desires like food, or some of them are desire for power. And we see all of that just rampant and unleashed in our society today. Now, so that's one reason for skepticism, is it's an extrinsic force or manipulation of humanity that's going on all the time. But there's another one that is at least as powerful, if not more so, and I say that because the general impression I get from the Bible is that Satan seems to have to do most of his dirty work in this world through what he can get humans to do. Satan is not, physically got a bunch of people running around, or a bunch of fallen angels physically that can do things, although there are things they can do there as well, and that remains up for discussion for future discussions.
Yeah, that'd be a good discussion we'll have in another time.
Yeah, because there are physical things they can do in this world, but it seems that a lot of them has to be done through humans. So what is the second reason? And I think, now I could be mistaken here, but I think maybe this could even be the number one reason for skepticism. And you could put it under the general heading of, say, human pride. Now, that has a lot of different facets, where one facet is the reluctance to admit that there's anything that's more powerful than we are. In fact, I see this where I see this a lot is in science fiction. I used to read a ton of science fiction starting in grade 11 when I first discovered it. And for the next year or so, I just read nothing but sci-fi. And I still will occasionally, when I find good sci-fi, I'll read that, good science fiction. So a lot of times you'll see in science fiction, humanity meets some alien, or you see this in the movies, some alien who are obviously way technologically superior to us, so they can build starships, travel through interstellar space, and arrive here on Earth. Yet somehow we succeed in defeating them by the end of the movie. There was one hilarious science fiction I read, short story, where humanity continued to start to explode, move outwards in our area of the galaxy amongst the nearest stars and start populating. But eventually we made contact with a huge interstellar federation that's been going, that's many different alien races and so forth. And the interesting thing is that by the end of the story, humanity had the whole federation mortgaged up to their eyeballs, and essentially humanity was ruling over the federation through financial lending and borrowing, which for some reason the Federation of Interstellar Species had not invented yet, borrowing money and mortgages and interest rates and everything else. That was pretty funny. But in general, you see this human pride. We want to feel that humanity is the top of the evolutionary pecking order. We are the greatest. And so the idea of a God threatens us. We don't like to be beholden to some vastly superior either alien race or ultimately God himself. And so there's a psychological resistance to anything that's greater than us. We want to be the God, so to speak. There's this God complex within humanity. You see it everywhere. We make up our own morals now. You see that rampant in our culture today. We feel that no God has the right to tell us, whether we can, what we do with our sexuality or abortion, for example. That's another big moral issue. Greed, war, all these sorts of things.
And I find it absolutely fascinating that as humans, we have this tendency to rebel against authority, yet demand that we have somebody in control over us.
Yeah, that's a very good observation, Sheldon. In fact, what I find is that the further a person, or mostly a person or a culture, moves away from God, from faith in God, the more faith they put in human governments. And you just see that rampant. If you can do surveys.
So is it the idea that I'm in control of this government because they serve me, yet so I can vote them in, but once they're in, I will, as long as they're on my team, I will, I'll agree to almost anything they ask me to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think
and that's both ways too. Like that, I see that on both sides totally.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. In fact, it's interesting that you can find people who profess strong faith in God, but actually talk and act as if it's the government that's going to save us. And wow, I lost hope in the government saving us decades ago, actually, not just days ago. But the government does have its role, a God-given role, actually, and it's an important role to play, but it's not the salvation of humanity. So, yeah, as you suggest, Sheldon, it's we still feel our God. We feel, first of all, there's a God complex within humanity and within many individuals. It's just a natural part of human nature that we want to call the shots. So moving from God, who threatens our God complex, we can become our own God, so to speak, but we do need some sort of system, and it's got to be a human system, not a divine system. So we want a human government there. We want control of that human government. We want a so-called democracy where we can vote people in and out. So we still got some control here. But the idea, the mentality seems to be that ultimately, since humans are essentially God, and there's also this thing that goes along with that, ultimately we're good. And if we're not good, we're just victims of our upbringing or of our environment. So if we can just improve the environment, everybody will be eventually pretty good. And so our governments, we should eventually see an improvement in government. So I see this raised in discussions quite often, pointed out that actually humanity and human civilization is improving all the time. We've got fewer, say, poor people below a certain level and so forth. Slavery, less and less of that all the time. So the argument goes. Now, those can all be challenged, mind you, but the idea here is that the further we move from God, the more faith we have to put in human government. And this is why you will see, if you were to do surveys on God versus how big of a government we should have, you will definitely see a correlation there.
Okay, so when I look back in the Old Testament, it was initially a theocracy. It was humans directly to God, and then the Israelites wanted the king. Now, they had seen it in other cultures. Why would that be? Is it the same thing?
Well, I mean, if you go back to that incident in the Bible, they were looking around at the surrounding nations, and they had a king who would kind of lead them into battle, so to speak. And I think it's partly due to because we as humans, it's human nature to want to put your trust in something you can see with your eyeballs. You can actually see that.
But they had a cloud. They had fire.
Yeah, that's true, Sheldon. But I don't know. There's this idea that familiarity breeds contempt was a popular saying when I was growing up. You get so familiar with something, you start taking it for granted. And this happens a lot within marriages. They're all in love with each other, and then they get married and they see each other every day, and they become more just they don't appreciate each other as much anymore, and then they just seem to treat each other eventually as just decorations or furniture.
They start destroying you in cribbage.
Yeah, yeah. Although we did have a good time. So I would say that's part of the reason why humanity at that stage wanted a king, is that they just wanted someone that would lead them into battle. And so they want right off the bat. So it's not just like, and they were already, if you read that passage and you read their history up to that point, that would be the period of the judges in the Bible. That'd be mostly the book of Judges will tell you that period of time up to their first king. And it was a mess. And it wasn't a mess because the theocracy doesn't work. It was a mess because people just drift away from God. They don't.
I find that, and I find Judges, one of the things I remember in Bible school is that in Judges you have this, you got somebody coming in, they clean things up, and then without fail, they did what was right in their own eyes.
Yeah, that's a key phrase.
That phrase is used over and over again. And that should be on the dollar bill.
Yeah. They did what was right in their own eyes.
Like, not in God we trust in the U.S., but they did what was right in their own eyes. Yeah. That is the culture we have today.
Mm-hmm. In fact, that we have a tendency to think, it's called a chronological fallacy, is that we are actually improving as humanity. But no, human nature actually hasn't changed. Technology has, for sure. But human nature, no. You go back and read these accounts from 4,000 years ago. Well, you can just relate to these people. They're just like us. But there's this idea that we have a tendency, that's human nature, to want to call the shots. We want to be our own boss. And we do not want to be under the authority of God or anybody else, in which case we do what is right in our own eyes. And that is just rampant in our culture today. With our culture today, is not just doing what is right in their own eyes. They proclaim it as a basic human right that nobody has the right to impose their morality on me. And in fact, it goes so far as to say it's even wrong if you question my own views and morality. That's offensive, so to speak. You have to go along with my morality or my views, or at least acknowledge that that is your truth, and I would never want to do or say anything that will that will challenge that. So that's the problem, is that first of all, people have this built-in tendency, not built-in, I should say God never built this into us. This is a flaw in human nature. It's a form of spiritual insanity to see physical. Let's say there's a psychological disorder where people, let's say, believe they're Napoleon, for example. That's a famous one. Somebody thinks they're Napoleon, or somebody thinks they're a bear. So they think there's something they're actually not. And the problem with that is that people would call them on that. They think they're not. But when it comes time to thinking we're God, nobody's really calling us on that. And so we're moving ahead in that same direction we have for it's a cycle. People got, when things are really bad, people tend to turn back to God. We've seen the same thing throughout the millennia. When they get really good and you're prosperous and everything is flourishing, then people start to become self-focused. What can I have? What more things can I have? How many more wives can I have? Or how much more power can I get? What can I do now that I couldn't do before because I got lots of money here now, so to speak? So when things get really wealthy and prosperous, then people start doing what's right in their own eyes. And then you have a collapse of that culture, and it just goes on and on, century after century. And we're in it right now. In fact, I would say that has peaked probably 20 years ago. And now we're beginning to see a collapse of our civilization that will get more rapid, simply because people are doing what's right in their own eyes. But we've wandered quite far from the original topic of skepticism, but it explains why.
It is, but this is a symptom of what skepticism brings up, is you end up in a no morals, no underlying framework to work with, because everything is doubtful.
Yeah, well, I should say, though, that some skeptics would strenuously deny that they got no morals. For example, I just talked with a person recently whose the fundamental moral premise is that it's morally wrong for your will to be interfered with. Now, that has huge issues.
So if my will is to kill that person, they wouldn't defend themselves?
Well, they would, because it's their will that they not get killed. But you see, now we have a problem.
Now we have a fight.
You have your will says that guy, cut me off in traffic. I want to beat him up. The guy who cut you off in traffic says, no, you were driving way too slow. And it's my will that you don't beat me up and that I cut in front of you. So now you have a conflict, and that occurs with different moral codes. So it's an interesting thing. That's a totally different discussion on the fundamental moral axioms that people would have. But the problem with that, though, is that it is held by that person, but not necessarily the next person. So you have maybe not no morals, but you have different moral codes, different moral axioms, and moral rules, and they're all in conflict with everybody else's. And that doesn't go very far as well.
Especially when you believe that everybody is able to make those decisions on their own.
Yeah.
And that's where it really breaks down, because if my moral code, which is my truth, and your truth and your moral code don't line up, it's whoever's stronger wins.
And unfortunately, that's the sad truth. The most powerful win. It's not necessarily always the largest percentage of the population win. It can often be, no, it's the most powerful within the population that will win. So you can often get a small group of very powerful people. Maybe an extreme form would be a dictatorship, for example, imposing their will on the entire population. But even in our democracy, I've written letters to my MPs, and what I get back is usually, well, this is our position. They're not representing me or our constituents. They're representing their party. And how big is this party? Well, I guess they're, There's only a certain number of people, a very tiny minority of Canadians can be politicians, elected officials. But of course, the way out is to, in the next election, hopefully we can vote them out. But skepticism is often, so the question is, there are direct approaches to skepticism, and then is the question, why are you skeptical about things pertaining to God and faith and so forth? And we've been focusing on that. And the fundamental thing is, we don't want, there's this instinct that we don't want to be beholden to a higher or more powerful being. We would like to be that being. We want to be God. And why is that tendency within us? I think one of the reasons why is because God actually created us in his own image and likeness. So we've created to be like God. We're not gods. We're just created to be in the likeness of God, a model of God. But in creating us that way, we have enormous capabilities. And those capabilities can be misused, including free will can be misused to commit all sorts of atrocities that God would not want us to normally do. So that's one type of pride. Another type of pride is just this general pride of humanity, is that we're the best, and our science is almost our temple. And science maybe can't explain right now how life began on Earth, but we'll discover something down the road. So I often see in skepticism this appeal to undiscovered discoveries or future discoveries or undiscovered knowledge. So there's the skepticism is justified on the basis that, well, that's a good argument for God's existence. Say the origin of nature would require a non-natural cause. They might grant that, but then they'll say later on we'll discover, maybe, science is always discovering new things, and maybe we'll do that. And my response to that is, well, it's true that we know only a fraction of what there is to know, but I can tell you with certainty that science will never, ever discover what caused nature, because science depends on nature, the laws of nature, space-time, matter, and energy in order to operate. It can never investigate something that logic dictates must be not natural. You can't even test it's totally the wrong tool. So one thing we know with certainty, that whatever it was that brought the universe into existence, it will not be natural. We know that with logical certainty. And I think I've talked about it on some other podcasts, and certainly on my website. I've talked about it in my YouTube videos.
Yeah, and I'm looking at just the amount of evidence and the lack of other options with evidence. And you have to basically deny that the evidence is... You have to deny the theory. You can't deny the evidence.
Yeah, well, some would say they're skeptical, like they'd use their skepticism on the evidence itself. But fortunately, the evidence itself is, I like to start with things that are commonly granted, even in the academic world, that some basic premises, some basic pieces of evidence. So if you want to deny that, then the approach would be, well, if you're going to deny this, you're going to have to toss out pretty much all of history, or you're going to have to toss out science, because science is heavily based on observations that are just as valid as this observation over here on that particular pottery sherd, whatever the inscription is there. So one of the things that my approach is with a skeptic would be to say, okay, can you justify your skepticism in light of the strength of the evidence that's before you? And they might often say, well, yeah, I'm still skeptical of the evidence. And so the next step is to say, okay, and what's the alternative? You got to have some other option here. So what is that other option? Let's call it option X. And my next question is, okay, so what evidence have you got to support option X? Here's the evidence to support option A, for example. And what about option X? And what I find is that almost never is there even any evidence to support option X, or if there is, it's substantially less robust than this evidence over here. So even though I would concur that this evidence for what I'm trying to defend here doesn't prove it's true with 100% certainty, it is actually stronger than the evidence for the other competing theory. Now, this is where the appeal to some unknown discovery that might happen somewhere in the future cuts in. They'll say, yes, but someday we might discover that evidence. Fine, but we have to operate today on the basis of what we know today. That's the most rational position to hold, is on the basis of what we currently know. This is where the evidence points. And when we look at the evidence for, let's say, the validity of Scripture, what we have today with whether Jesus actually existed, the evidence for the existence of God in so many different ways, we have to say that, well, yeah, the preponderance of evidence actually points to this. And we could have whole episodes, maybe in the future we'll have those, as to what some of this evidence is and how powerful it is. And in some cases, it's the only option on the table. It's the only empirically verified option on the table. In some ways, there isn't even, let's say, the evidence that the information encoded in genomes, if it's statistically significant, requires a mind. There is only one thing science has ever observed that will produce statistically significant levels of information, functional information, and that is a mind, an intelligent mind. There is no other. There's stories out there, yes, on how this could possibly happen with accidents and mutations and so forth, but we've never actually been able to reproduce any successful results from that story, even when we speed it up by many orders of magnitude in a computational simulation. So the question is this: can you justify your skepticism in light of the fact that the evidence that supports your option is substantially less robust than the evidence supports this option? Now, unless you can come up with a third option that has even better evidence still, the most rational position to take at this point is that I will put my faith in this option here, which has the more stronger, more robust evidence, rather than in the creative story that appeals to maybe some undiscovered evidence we might happen upon, in 200 years' time.
There is an amazing commercial right now. It's by a company called FanDuel. It's a gambling commercial, but they open up the commercial saying basically the odds of the world happening and you being created is basically zero.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it's true. I mean, I can pull up paper.
So their solution is you should gamble more.
Well, maybe they're thinking, well, yeah.
So I found that very funny.
It's not exactly a get-rich plan. That's not one of those. So we could examine that rationally too.
So just the fact that you were born means you were lucky, therefore you should gamble more.
Yeah.
But I just found that because we've been having this discussion for almost a year now. We've been doing this podcast or this live stream for almost 9 months. We've been talking about the odds of creation happening, or the odds of the world existing, mm-hmm. and they are almost zero.
Pretty much zero. Like they're as close to zero. In science, the odds of getting, let's say, the first 280 odd proteins required for the simplest life form are so small, and I can demonstrate how small those are. It's not like I'm just making up numbers here. I can actually take protein families, run them through a program, and come out with answers that tell you just what the odds are or what the probability is. They are so small that it's the closest to zero of anything in science. Like normally in science, you would never even consider for a second any solution that had a probability that low. It's just so vanishingly small that it's never going to happen in the history of this universe before the last stars burn out. And even if there were trillions of universes, you would need far more than just trillions of universes before you accidentally found even just 2 or 3 of these protein families. That's how small they are. But the skeptic says, well, first of all, they might appeal to creative stories. And that's all we have right now is creative stories. It's all we had since Darwin, for the last 150 odd years. There are creative stories that consistently are falsified or consistently failed to be verified. And that's all you have for the other options. So the most rational option to take, even if you can't prove either one, is that, well, we'll go with the one we know intelligent minds can produce vast levels of functional information. even the memory space required for this one episode here vastly exceeds what the universe is capable of producing over 10 billion years. Just for 1 hour of two humans talking.
People have been thrown in jail for life with less evidence. And it's been beyond a reasonable doubt.
Yeah.
So that's what court of law depends on. Now, in life, we want answers to all this stuff. And if you call yourself a skeptic, or if you've been working with a skeptic and discussing religion and stuff, hopefully this live stream has helped you. If you have any questions, you have comments you want to make, if you're a skeptic and you have the question to cause Kirk to become a skeptic, throw it in the chat. We'd love to see it, and maybe we'll discuss it next time. I need to run, but thank you so much for Kirk for your time, and we will talk to you all next time. Bye, everybody.
Bye for now.